The Obama administration made sweeping changes to the Fair Labor Standards Act with a new rule that said anybody making a salary of less than $47,000 will automatically qualify for overtime pay when they work more than 40 hours a week. But just this week, Texas Judge Amos Mazan blocked that law just as the holiday season gets underway. For more on what this means for employers and staffers, I'd like to welcome David Lewis. He's the president and CEO of Operations Inc., a human resource outsourcing firm. Welcome back, David.
Hi, Danielle. How are you?
Great, thanks. Now, people are out and about shopping, dining out at all the restaurants. It's a busy time for a lot of folks who work in these industries. I know many of them were banking on this overtime pay that was set to begin on December 1st. Are they still entitled to it, or what's to become of this?
Well, they're not entitled to it anymore based on this decision by this court in Texas. And now it's going to be up to the businesses who already put some of these plans in motion to decide how they want to react. So going to an employee who you've been talking to for the last couple of months, planning for December 1st when this law was to go into place, and tell them all that stuff that we discussed about your raise or about your schedule change, all those things we're not going to do now, is not going to go over very well with a lot of these people.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of employees, particularly those in the retail and restaurant industry, were happy about this overtime rule. But, you know, they scrambled, I think, right? They scrambled to get more employees and made a lot of changes. Do you think that they're going to keep a lot of that in place, or do you think they're going to revert back to their old ways?
You know, it depends. I mean, I think there's a segment of the workplace population and the employers in particular who had to make a lot of adjustments in order to make this work and make it financially viable. Because what the law essentially was going to say is that people who weren't eligible for overtime before, if they continue to work the same number of hours they were working, they either need to get paid more in the form of a base salary higher than a certain threshold, or they need to get paid OT. So for the business owner who had several of those individuals and that kind of impact, they'd have to go ahead and either hire additional people, as you referenced before, to add to staff or make some significant staffing changes, schedule changes, and pay changes. You're at November 23rd now. That is not something that you can necessarily easily reverse out of a full 7 days prior to this going into place. So I think for those that had to do the most, they're probably just going to go along with the changes they implemented. For those who had the least to do, they're going to have the hard decision about whether or not they want to go back to those employees that were going to be affected and tell them their pay raises are canceled or their schedule changes are canceled. And that may mean that someone who was told they can now start working 40 hours a week instead of 55 are going to now be told, never mind, you're working 55 come December 1.
Right. I mean, in a way, it's a victory for businesses, but it is temporary. And this overtime rule could be implemented again in a few months, right?
It could be, but I would be very careful about perceiving this as a temporary stop, because the way the mechanics work here is that now after this has been held up, the delay is going to, in theory, be long enough, according to most experts, to move all the way into the Trump administration. And the Trump administration Donald Trump came out during the course of his campaign and specifically said that he was not in favor of these changes. So on that basis, the expectation is that this is a dead change. This is not going to ever get implemented. There may be some level of change to the Fair Labor Standards Act sometime during the Trump administration. But I would not, and we're advising our clients not to assume that the law is just delayed. We're going on the basis that this is over, that it's not going to ever see the light of day again, and that while changes may come, it won't be in the form that the Obama administration had intended.
And the Obama administration is who put this in place to begin with. Given the Republican takeover of both houses of Congress, it is probably unlikely that the Labor Department will be able to revive this rule like many of the other rules that favor labor unions, right?
Well, and it's important to also understand that the way this was put in place was that this was put in place for the most part by executive order through the Department of Labor. Congress had no direct involvement, which was in part why this case was overturned, and as a result, the implementation of these changes was held up by the court in Texas. So if it does now go to Congress, which it would eventually do, it's more likely that the Trump administration would go that path. The question becomes, what will Congress go ahead and do with this? Will they make some kind of sweeping change, which, this piece of legislation is super old, very confusing, completely out of date. And this was a small piece of the puzzle that the Obama administration was changing. It needs an overhaul. The problem is that any overhaul is going to be now seen as unfavorable from the perspective of labor. The businesses do not want this. It's why this was not just about 21 states suing to turn this over. It was about 50 large business organizations, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who was against it. So the likelihood of seeing any significant change, yes, it will probably go through Congress, but I'm not sure you're going to see it anytime during 2017, for example, given the other issues the country and this administration are going to be facing.
And I do want to point out that it is more for businesses. It's more business friendly. There were some employees who actually were against it too. In some cases, more employers were just hiring more part-timers at low wages instead of dedicated full-timers. And then some employees got switched to hourly, and it felt like a demotion for them. So overall, I don't know if it was necessarily a good thing for everybody. What do you think? Because there were definitely employees who weren't for this.
Well, so for example, we work with a lot of nonprofits. And so from the nonprofits' perspective, when this law changed, their first view was, we still have the same amount of money today that we did yesterday. So even though the law has changed, the solutions that you can present to us are not going to be ones that can cost us anything more than we're already spending. So for those individuals, and when you say to them, oh, by the way, the person who's working 55 hours a week right now that's not getting paid overtime, but now has to be paid for their overtime, we can't afford to not have them work 55 hours a week. So you had a lot of people who basically had, believe it or not, their hourly rate dropped lower so that it could fit into this model. So you have some employees who, at least on the surface, looked at that and said, you know what, I don't like that. I don't think that that's fair. But if this is what the business has to do, this is what the business has to do. The reality, though, is that this is mostly a piece of law, a piece of legislation that is about the manager at a fast food restaurant or a service business who is working side by side with their employees, doing the work the employees do, their staff does. But while their staff works 50 hours and gets paid 10 hours of overtime, the manager doesn't. And in many cases, in a lot of those businesses, the manager actually makes less money every week than the people who are reporting to them.
Absolutely.
Those are the ones that are going to get hurt.
Especially when you look at those in the serving industry who perhaps make tips and those managers don't.
Correct.
Looking forward to the Trump administration, what do you expect is going to happen, and what do you think should happen in this case?
Well, I think as far as this legislation is concerned, it's going to cause some chaos over the course of the next couple of months as businesses make decisions as to how to manage against it. And then after that, the dust will settle. And I don't think we're going to be talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act in 2017. Again, I think that there are a lot of other issues that you're going to be dealing with in terms of changes of approach, changes of philosophy that this administration has against the Obama administration. And these types of issues involving labor, involving the Fair Labor Standards Act, probably aren't going to make it up on the radar. The only way that changes is if you get some type of countrywide protest associated with this particular injunction going into place. And that's distinctly possible. It's too soon to tell. We're only 24 hours or even less than 24 hours from when the decision hit. But you could absolutely see those employees that have been most affected, who now have that pay snatched out of their hands, go in some type of form of organized protest. That may put the pressure on the administration. Absent of that, I don't think this sees the light of day until at least 2018 again.
All right. Well, blocking the overtime regulation is a stunning blow to the Obama administration's economic legacy. It also affects 4.2 million workers. David Lewis, thanks for weighing in.
My pleasure.